Hey again everyone, this is Hannah DeWitt, your instructor, here with another pre-recorded lecture. This time we're going over chapter 15, which is from the earliest art to the Bronze Age. And so we're kind of transitioning into a different format for how these lectures are going to go. Now that we've covered all of the kind of major groups of art mediums and gotten the basics out of the way, we're going to start from the beginning and go through different periods of art history. So we're in the art history section of the class now, which is exciting. However, a bit less exciting. It's plenty exciting, but I'm more interested in more modern and contemporary art, but we have to start way back at the beginning. So without further ado, let's go to the oldest art in known human history. And this is the Paleolithic Period, which quite literally means the Old Stone Age. It was called that because they made tools primarily of stone, and it was pretty notable that people started making tools at this time because, it was really early in human development, and making tools was kind of a big deal. This started about 2.5 million years ago and was until 10,000 years ago, or not years ago, but before the Common Era. And also these people in the Paleolithic period were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and also their art was more naturalistic, which means that it was realistic to nature. It was trying to emulate what they saw and not making anything especially abstract. And while researchers were not sure, they speculate that most of the art was ritual-centric or focused on recording their hunting. So I've got a few more slides from my cohort, Erica Lewis. You can always tell when Erica made a slide because it'll have a black background. But I just really liked this kind of time period that they made with the tools. So this is Paleolithic Tools. 2 million years ago, we started with crude stone cutting tools in East Central Africa, and there was the development of imagination and invention for really the first time in human history. And also, humans started problem solving to fill certain needs. So if they needed something to eat out of, they would make a bowl. If they needed something to, stab an animal with, they'd make a sphere. A spear, not a sphere. And then moving on to 1 million years ago, there were more refined tools with sharp cutting edges. Let me silence my computer. Sorry, you're hearing my notifications. You won't anymore. Okay, so where were we? 1 million years ago. About 1 million years ago, people started making more refined tools with sharp cutting edges in Africa, Asia, and Europe, all kind of at the same time, but of their own developments. And then 250,000 years later, people started making more symmetrical designs like choppers and hand axes, and there was a higher awareness of the form and function of what they were creating. So about 100,000 years ago, beads and powders were sprinkled around grave sites, suggesting that there was a certain ritual, ceremony, or tradition that people were using them for, although the exact meaning is unknown. Most of these traditions we can tell because it's something that they did to honor their dead, and that just sounds like a ritual or a tradition to me. And then about 77,000 years ago, pieces of ochre engraved with symbols, like this example here, would create patterns, and that could have been practical, but it seemed to be symbolic or decorative. So people just started making art because they wanted to make something pretty, and that is a very important step. This was found in 2002 in South Africa, but it's much older than that. Now let's talk a bit about figures. In the Paleolithic period, we first start seeing the human figure being replicated or portrayed. And the way that they portray the human figure is quite interesting and shows us a lot about our first thoughts of the figure and the nude as the entirety of humanity. So during the stone period of found stone figures, we start with the Holhe-Fels figure, and that is on the left. You can see it from two different angles. This is the oldest surviving carved human figure, and it was actually worn as a necklace. And then on the right, you can see the Woman of Willendorf. This is a very famous sculpture. For a long time, we thought that this was the oldest human figure ever found, but now the Holhe-Fels figure has been carbon dated to be earlier than the Woman of Willendorf, but they're both very old. They're both very old, but they're both very at the very beginnings of us replicating the human form. And you can see both of them have this very exaggerated part of the female features, the curvaceousness, the breasts having like a large stomach as well. And people think that this may have been, I don't know if religious is the right word, but spiritual in a way, because it emphasizes the body parts that are most important in fertility. So having working breasts or having like a large midsection able to handle the pressures of giving birth and things like that. So it really goes to show what people valued in not just women, but humans in general, because there was not for a long time after this did they ever start depicting men. And this is going off of a very cis-normative idea of like women being like the ones who have vaginas and men being the ones who have penises, even though we've kind of progressed past that at this point. For the purposes of this, I'm just going to be saying women and men. But really, the most important value was the ability to procreate. And that kind of makes sense if you think back at the time. The existence of humanity was kind of on the line, you know, you never knew if we were all just going to die out and go extinct at any point. It was very important to keep fertility up and to help, also help infant mortality not happen. So many infants passed away at this time just because of complete lack of healthcare. But it really just shows the priorities of the civilization. So now let's get into some painting from the Paleolithic period. These paintings would rarely show humans. Normally they would show animals or some other things, but mostly animals. And they are actually the oldest known paintings in human history. They were found in Indonesia decades ago, and they were only able to be dated pretty recently, and they were dated at least 39,900 years ago, but could have been longer. And the subject matter here is actually a pig deer, which is now extinct. Now, in this example, there's like there's a circle around the hand and then a little kind of crude drawing of the pig deer, just so that you can see what's going on, because it's kind of really hard to make out after all of the like flecks happened all over top of it. So that's just to help you see. That's not actually part of it, the little white lines. But the purpose of this naturalistic Paleolithic art has been highly debated amongst scholars. It was long believed for the purpose being to bring the spirits of animals into hunt-related rituals. But also some experts theorized that these sites that were painted on the walls of were actually sanctuaries and holy places that people came to either worship or have whatever kind of spiritualistic rituals or just experiences that they might have had at the time. Both of these theories are totally plausible, and we genuinely just don't know which one it is, or if it's something entirely different. It's kind of hard to guess what people were doing back before they could write about it. And another example of some Paleolithic painting is the Chauvet Cave in France. This is more recently discovered and more recently carbon dated to having been more recent. And because of that, it's better preserved, so you can see it quite a bit more clearly. So this is a wall painting of animals, as you can see, and it's painted with charcoal and other earthen pigments. So people were using what they could find in nature to create these marks. Back to some more slides from Erica Lewis. let's talk a bit about petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are a type of drawing from the Paleolithic period that's formed by scratching away at exposed stone to create a rock carving. So it's kind of like engraving, but just from a very, very long time ago with less advanced tools. So some of these were above ground, and that's harder to date compared to the works that were underground in caves and such, because those can be dated by the soil and rock around them, whereas the ones that have been exposed to air for so long and don't have soil and rock around them, you can't carbon date the soil and rock around them. And also these can be easily eroded over, so many hundreds and thousands of years that elements like acid rain or industrial developing have really kind of destroyed many of these images. But here is an example that is not destroyed yet, so you can see that. Now let's get into Neolithic art, or the Neolithic age. And this is basically saying the new Stone Age. So Paleolithic was old stone, and Neolithic is new stone. So it's still the Stone Age, but it's newer, it's more modern, it's more recent to now. So this was a shift from the Paleolithic period and a major turning point in human history. And it may have arisen near modern day Iraq, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where because it was kind of broad. But this is marked by the agricultural revolution. That's when we really shift from Paleolithic to Neolithic. Because remember, Paleolithic peoples were hunter-gatherers and nomadic. And now people are staying in one place, planting crops, and then harvesting them. And so this came with a lot of implications. It required storage in the form of clay pots. It reflects a shift in living patterns, not moving around nomadically. And also, as these sort of farm type of situations develop, a human hierarchy starts to develop where one person might own the land and have other people help them with it. Also, people started making geometric abstract art for the first time. Things were not always naturalistic. And a lot of the motifs, although it wasn't completely naturalistic like before, a lot of the motifs within this, a lot of the repeated imagery derived from plant and animal forms. So it's still inspired by nature, but for the first time, people were really starting to make things just because they look nice, not because they're recording what's in front of them. So here is an example of some Neolithic art. This is an earthenware beaker, an earthenware beaker from Susa, and it features ibexes, which an ibex is kind of like a very old mountain goat, and you can kind of see the goat shape and then the horns coming back into a big circle. But it took the natural form of the ibex and abstracted it into triangular and circular shapes. So, still starting with nature, but getting a little creative. Another example of Neolithic art is this pottery that's actually from China. And you'll really start to see people just started popping up everywhere, making things kind of around the same times, but independently. And this specifically was a burial urn from the Kansu province. And it has this bold interlocking design, and people think that the design was probably inspired by the bottom of cowrie shells, because this type of spiral is found in nature in shells like that. Now let's get into some Neolithic structures. They are mostly primitive, still putting quotes around that word just because I feel like it's a huge yikes, but maybe it's fine. But they were still very in early development. They didn't have the type of elegance and tools that we have nowadays, is what that means. And so this example is very famous. This is Stonehenge. This is quite sophisticated for the time. It's got the whole, probably the first, I think, ever post and lintel situation here. So, hey, maybe all of that architecture stuff was important to learn. And you can see that they replaced wooden structures with stone. So these are made of stone. And because it's made of stone, we're still able to see it now, whereas wooden things would have rotten by now. And people debate the function of Stonehenge. Some people say that it's a site for funerary rites. That's the most current theory, but it may have had various functions. It could have been plenty of things. So, yeah. Now we're getting into the Bronze Age. This is when people started making bronze. I mean, not making, but like finding bronze in the earth and then refining it and using it. And specifically, we're looking at Mesopotamia here. So, first of all, let's talk about what a civilization is, because technically Mesopotamia is the world's first real civilization. So, what does that mean? It's a term distinguishing cultures that have complex social orders and high degrees of technical development. Some of the main elements to a civilization are that they have agriculture and animal husbandry, that there's occupational specialization, different people have different jobs, there's writing, and also at the same time as all of this, people started producing bronze. So all of this kind of happened all at once in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is also called the land between the rivers, and you can see that here in the map. It's the broad plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, which is now central and northern Iraq. And also, Egypt started developing their own Bronze Age kind of at the same time, almost parallel to the same time, but it wasn't quite as early as Mesopotamia. So we are going to be covering Egypt after we cover Mesopotamia. But yeah, the urban civilization developed earlier in Mesopotamia than it did in Egypt, but they were like a close second. So let's talk about Sumer, which is in Mesopotamia. It's just a place, it's a city-state. So they first started having city-states. We had like government for the first time, social hierarchy and structure. They also had a hierarchy of different nature gods that they worshipped in these places called ziggurats, which you can see an example of here. They believed that there was a sacred mountain linking heaven and earth, and also they used sun-baked bricks that formed platforms on a solid base with a shrine on top. That's kind of what a ziggurat is these big platforms that create this solid base like a plateau, and then they have a shrine on top. And the lack of stone that they had at the time, or that they were like able to use at the time, led to the use of brick and wood for building. And because of that, very little Mesopotamian architecture remains, because brick and wood are not as long lasting throughout, hundreds and thousands of years. So we don't get to see as much of what they did, but what we can see is quite interesting. Also from Sumer, there was, in less of a architectural way and more of just a handheld art pieces way, there was sculpture. Art served mostly ritualistic needs. This example is a vase from Morka, and it is one of the earliest examples of narrative relief sculpture. So we all remember what relief means, and this is an example of a low relief because it's only carved a little bit into the surface. It's not like super sticking out and like having like someone's hand sticking out all the way or something. But this depicts humans in harmony with the natural world. So that's nice. Yeah, so here is kind of the beginnings of relief sculpture and sculpture in general just becoming more and more refined. Now, still in Sumer, the culture flourished among independent city-states that were adjacent to each other but had separate leaderships. And around 2300 BCE, under the authority of the Akkadian king, we find this relic, this piece of ancient artwork. And this was a highly sophisticated carving of the ruler's head. And they used the lost wax casting technique that we talked about before in metal casting. And they also really show an intricate expression and hairstyle. There's just a lot of details here. You can really see that people are starting to hone the craft. Now let's talk about ancient Egypt, because they very much not long after Mesopotamia. I mean, when we're in like ancient art history, I'll say not long, and I mean like 100,000 years, but in the grand scheme of ancient art history, that's not long after. So ancient Egypt started developing its own civilization not very long after Mesopotamia did. And there's little outside influence of their culture due to the geography of the region. There wasn't like a lot of access to travel to other places and get to know other cultures. So they really figured it out all on their own. And because of this, Egypt was able to develop some really distinctive styles that look very specific to Egypt because there wasn't any cultural influence from outside of Egypt. And these Bronze Age styles showed themselves in architecture, painting, and sculpture. And they remained relatively unchanged for about 2,500 years. So really they just made their own specific style. It's pretty easy to see that something is from ancient Egypt when you see it, because it's got that certain style to it. So we're going to talk about the architecture, painting, and sculpture, all from ancient Egypt. Let's start with the architecture. So these, I'm sure you know, are the Great Pyramids. They were built as burial vaults for pharaohs, which were a sort of god/king, first kind of people to believe in just the divine right of ruling. But yeah, so these were burial vaults for the pharaohs, and people made these huge stone blocks and stacked them together without mortar. They were just so heavy that they were able to, the weight held everything together. And there are interiors with narrow passageways throughout. And also, fun fact, this is kind of a fun fact. A lot of people think that the pyramids were built by slaves, but lately some historians have been saying that actually the people who built the pyramids had some pretty good workers' rights and worked in I might be wrong about how long it is. 3 month. I think 3-month shifts, and then would take time off, and they had food provided for them and things like that. So it was less of an abysmal working situation than a lot of people assume it was. So now let's continue talking about tombs. The Great Pyramids were tombs as well, and there were a lot of different tombs that are pretty essential to understanding ancient Egyptian art history. So tombs, at least in the Egyptian mindset and belief system, the preservation of the body extended life beyond death. So if your body wasn't preserved, then you wouldn't be able to go to the afterlife. And all of the effort that they put into embalming bodies and displaying artifacts is what has informed today's knowledge of ancient Egypt. If they weren't so particular about the way that they preserved their bodies, we wouldn't know anywhere near as much. This example is a funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, and it is a grandiose structure among cliffs and also one of the first examples of a woman leader in history, so that's pretty exciting. Now, a sort of character to get to know in the Egyptian belief system is Senenmut, which is the Great Steward. So Senenmut was considered an overseer of a lot of the projects that people worked on. He supervised some of Queen Hatshepsut's most important building projects, to be specific. He actually began as a tutor to the queen's daughter, and then was appointed administrator of the temple at Karnak, and then eventually was put in charge of Queen Hatshepsut's funerary temple. And because of that, he was actually allowed to build his funerary temple adjoining the queen's. So he had his own little temple next to hers. Now let's talk about sculpture and wall painting. Here we've got an example of some ancient Egyptian sculpture, and you can see we're really getting more and more refined in understanding how to manipulate the medium to create something more realistic. So these were compact, solidly structured figures embodying qualities of strength and geometry. It's similar to architecture in that way of how geometrically oriented these designs were. So this example is of the pharaoh Mycerinus, or Menkaura, and two goddesses. And you can tell that there was attention to human anatomy, but it was placed within a more geometric scheme than humans naturally are. And the classic frontal pose for royal portraits with the left foot forward to show that he's the pharaoh was something important to note about this time. Now later, when you see people portrayed from this side in ancient Egypt, they would normally have a foot forward, and that was not necessarily to show that they were royal, but just to show, to be able to show both legs, to make it, like I said once in a previous pre-recorded lecture, Egyptians would oftentimes just draw or paint things in the way that was easiest to recognize what they were, and to do that they would put one foot forward. But in this case, the foot forward actually shows that the figure in the middle is the pharaoh, and you can see the figure on the left, or what we see as the left, it's on their right, has their foot slightly more forward, and this kind of than the one on the right, and this kind of shows the hierarchy of how holy or how important of a god or goddess these figures were. Now, still talking about sculpture and wall paintings, this is a very famous piece. This is the mask from the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. So if you've Tutankhamun, it's kind of a hard word to say. A lot of people shorten it to King Tut. And this is the only tomb to have remained completely intact until modern times, so we were able to learn the most from this tomb. And this sculpture in particular has inlaid gold on the surface, and it's a formal blend of naturalism and abstract idealism, so taking what the pharaoh actually looked like in real life, and then also kind of shifting it and abstracting it to be a more ideal version of what they thought a human should look like. And also the human figure is either completely frontal or a completely profile view. So if you look at it from the front or the side, it works both ways. But if you look at it from a sort of 3/4, it doesn't work as well. And then last but not least, let's talk about ancient Egyptian wall painting. So this example is a wall painting from the tomb of Nebamun. And you can see there's flat shapes portraying elements of each subject, and there's clear, non-confusing shapes here, so they very much wanted you to be able to tell what everything in this is. Also, a very important thing to note is the use of hierarchic scale. That means that the size of how large a human is presented relates to how important that human was. So the biggest figure is the most important, and the smaller the figures get, they have less and less important roles in society. There's also quite a bit of attention to detail in animal life. You can see some really detailed birds here especially, and fish. And also you can see in the background this includes hieroglyphs, which is a sort of pictorial language, a way of writing. And yeah, so that wraps it up for the earliest art to the Bronze Age. I look forward to discussing this in class, and have a good one.